So thank you very much for meeting with us today and for offering your interview. I am Debbie Rubenstein. I'm meeting with Dr. Brittany Hunt, and it is the 8th of December, 2022. This week there were an average of 122 cases of COVID reported in Mecklenburg County, which is a 24% increase over the last 2 weeks. Therefore, and so at this point in time, both Dr. Hunt and I are comfortable not wearing masks. I did want to ask you, how do you prefer to be referred to in this interview?
You can call me Dr. Hunt or Brittany,
Dr. Hunt,
however,
okay.
it's fine.
Totally fine.
Doesn't matter to me.
Well, thank you again for meeting with us.
One more thing, do I look at you or do I look
No,
here?
you can look at me.
Okay.
That's fine.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, this is
Okay,
great.
okay. Yeah,
You
yeah.
can look wherever you want, but we don't need you to look at me.
Okay.
That feels very awkward, right?
Yeah, I'm like, oh,
no, you can
answer
look at
this.
me. Not to worry, look at me. Can you give us a brief introduction of who you are and also a visual description of how you look today?
Yes, so my name is Dr. Brittany Danielle Hunt. I'm a member of the Lumbee Tribe of North Carolina. I'm from Lumberton, North Carolina. Work currently at Duke University as a postdoctoral research, but in a few weeks transitioning into a professor job at Virginia Tech. So really excited about that. And then visually, I have hazel eyes, light-colored skin, freckles. I have hair past my shoulders that's brown. That's usually curly, but today it's straight. And I have some cedar wood earrings on that hang down kind of past my shoulder as well.
Thank you. That's very helpful.
Okay.
So were you here in Charlotte, in the city of Charlotte, through the pandemic?
Yes.
Yeah. How long have you lived here?
Since 2017, so 5 years.
5 years.
Yeah,
5
yeah.
years. And did you come here from Lumberton?
No, I came from Raleigh, so I was working at NC State before this, and I came here for a doctoral program.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Did you always know you wanted to study Indigenous life and Indigenous culture?
No, that was never my intention. It just kind of became something that came about from my experiences in college. So from moving from my tribal territory to a place that was not so tribally friendly or Indigenous friendly kind of shaped my experiences and led me on this path.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
And you were teaching through the pandemic?
I taught a few classes, so one at UNC Charlotte at the very, very beginning of the pandemic that was then transitioned into an online class, and then I also taught at Davidson for one semester as well, yes, during the pandemic.
Had you been teaching before the pandemic as well?
Yes, so I had to go from in-person formats to then online.
What was that like?
It's difficult because I really enjoy being in front of people, and being in a classroom with students is a totally different feel from being online. I feel like sometimes as an online professor, you're not fully a real person to a student in some ways. And so being in the classroom, I can see students' faces, I can feel their energy, I can feel if they need a break or if they're tired or if they're really high energy that day, and I kind of feed off of that. And so being in an online classroom where people are on mute or don't have their camera on is a totally different experience, and it feels kind of muted too in a way.
Were you both teaching and taking classes during the pandemic?
I was, no, I was in my dissertation phase during the time at UNC Charlotte, and so I wasn't taking classes, I was writing then. Yeah.
Did you have access to the research materials you needed?
Yes, I did. Mm-hmm.
Do you access online? Is that how you went?
Yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And how did you have what you needed to make the adjustment to online?
I don't think anybody has what they need. I think it's different if you start off knowing you're going to be teaching an online class because you can kind of prepare. But then to go from 1 week being in person to the very next week being all exclusively online was a really, really difficult transition. And it was in a writing intensive course where I felt like students needed a little bit more one-on-one time that an online format just doesn't provide as much comfort for that. And so I don't think anybody could have provided professors with the amount of support that we needed during that time, or students really. Yeah, for sure.
Did you notice, what kind of impact did you notice that having on your students?
I think it's hard for them to go from in-person to online as well. I know a lot of students do prefer online classes, But I still think it's difficult for anyone to adjust to what students were being asked to adjust to. And so I think it harmed them in ways for a social aspect. So you're not really around your peers like that anymore to kind of bounce ideas off of, or maybe to get help from them. I mean, you can always email your peers, but it's different than sitting directly beside them in a classroom. And so it alters the social experience of the classroom that I think is really important for students learning together in kind of a collaborative space. And I think also moving to online, students are just more comfortable sometimes having their camera off and, again, staying muted. And so sometimes we went from having really lively classes to then having just kind of less rich discussions in general. And also people are afraid and they're scared and they didn't know what was happening in the world at that time. And so it was really challenging for students, especially at first.
I'm curious, did you notice a difference in the experience in any way between the students at UNCC versus the students at Davidson? The universities are very different in size and demographics and things like that.
Yeah, the students are different at both schools, but so when I was at UNC Charlotte, like I said, the pandemic happened directly in the middle of the semester, and so we transitioned from in-person to online. But then at Davidson, the pandemic had been happening for about 9 months or so, or maybe 10 months or so before I started teaching. And so students were at least more used to an online format because they'd already had another semester of purely online from having the fall semester. And so they were more acclimated to that kind of an experience. But it was still difficult for me because I was teaching there for the first time. And so I didn't know what the students would be like or what the campus was really like. And so I was trying to acclimate to that, and then also acclimating to being a purely online class. So yeah, it was a lot different experience.
Were you situated in your home for teaching?
Yes.
And prior to the pandemic, did you have the opportunity to go back to Lumberton to visit with your community? And if so, how did that change?
Yeah, I visit very, very regularly. So I go home at least once a month. And the longest I've ever been away from home, I think, is 6 or 8 weeks. And so I've never gone longer than that from being home. Sometimes I even go home more often than once a month. Sometimes I go twice. So I'm very, very connected to my home community by visits, by social media, and by keeping in communication on the phone. The pandemic did put a little bit of a halt to that. And the idea of not seeing my mom for longer than a certain amount of time started to make me, I went into like a small panic mode. I don't even think she knows that, but I was very afraid of not being able to be home and like seeing my family. But I still would go home, but just when we would go out in public, we would wear masks. But unfortunately, the community that I come from, COVID hit it almost harder than anywhere else in the state. It's a pretty small, it's the largest county in the state, but it's made up of a lot of different small communities. Indigenous people, I think, are particularly impacted by the pandemic because we gather together very regularly. And so on Sundays, we all gather together to eat at my grandparents' house very often for Sunday dinners. And then we go to church on Sunday mornings with our families. And so when I'm home, I'm always with different family members, kind of in larger group settings. And that did not, it changed, but it didn't really stop with the pandemic. And then people in my community started dying who I know, my granddaddy's close friends, some of his relatives, people from my church. Thank you so much. A girl who I worked with at a high school who was a student of mine actually ended up passing away from the pandemic. So there were lots of deaths that were happening that made it even more real to me than I think it was for others. I recall once in Charlotte, I was getting, I think, a massage or something during the pandemic or something like that, and someone said, she said that she didn't understand the big deal. And I thought, what a luxury to feel that way if you haven't known someone who's died, for example. My stepdad's brother was one of the first deaths of COVID that I had heard of. He died in, I think, I think, May or June. And I know the pandemic really kind of started here in March of 2020. And so it was very, very real to me from an early point. Also, just for a little bit of background, Indigenous people during the Spanish influenza died at higher rates than the rest of the population, also because of our deep desire, and not even desire, but need to gather together. And so there were times where people were sick, but they would still gather with their sick loved ones because they wanted to pass on stories or traditions to them, and then they would also end up sick. And so I ended up seeing kind of similar things happening in my own community, where we were still gathering, even if it seems foolish to other people, but there is this, I don't know, this strong need to be together.
How did you talk about that with your family, and how did you reconcile it for yourself, those competing directives?
Yeah, it was really hard. I got the vaccine as soon as it was available. Almost everyone in my family got the vaccine, even though there was a lot, and there still is a lot of vaccine hesitancy in Indigenous communities and in communities of color in general. And so I definitely did that. I have a lot of family members who work in healthcare, and so I was also taking advice from them. Like I said, I was wearing masks anytime I was out in public. Anytime I was around kind of larger groups, I was wearing a mask, even if people would taunt me or say it was silly. So I was doing what I could do to take precautions. And actually, I did not end up getting COVID until this year, and I got it at Duke, where I work. My first week of work, I got it there. So I never got it from being home in Lumberton, or with my family or anything like that. But so I did things like that. Most of my family did not get COVID either until this year, so kind of later, in a later stage of the pandemic. And so we were really fortunate in that regard. And so we did, I feel like, what we could do as a family to protect ourselves while still gathering together. But there were times where it was hard for me to reconcile being in such large groups with my family, where I would think, oh, what if I got it in Charlotte and then I'm bringing it back to my grandfather? Or like, what if I give it to my mom? I would not be able to forgive myself if she would get really sick. And so there were definitely times like that. I tested myself almost constantly, especially when they made the at-home tests. And so I feel like I did the best that I felt I could do while still maintaining my need to be with my family as much as I possibly could, especially during that sensitive time.
So you were able to continue going back and visiting?
Yes, so I would go still about once a month.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see that. Do you feel like, you said that most folks, when they did get COVID, got it this year?
Yes, yeah, all of my family got it this year except my dad, actually, and my uncle. I don't think he's gotten it either.
Has that, how have people responded to that? Have they felt like, well, you know, it was bound to happen eventually, or, and I'm glad that I didn't get it when we didn't know what to do, or how are they feeling about that?
At first we thought we had like these great, strong genes in the family, and then it started hitting all of us one after one. And I guess it's because I think a lot of people became a lot more lax this year, and including myself. And so I think that's why a lot of us probably got it, even though we're vaccinated, and I'm boosted as well. But yeah, even when I got it, when I first found out, I remember talking to my mom on the phone, and I started crying and she was like, well, talk to me about why you're upset. And I said, what if I have given this to someone else? And so I knew that I was probably going to be okay, because it was one of the variants that wasn't really making people that sick. So I knew I would probably be okay. But I was thinking, like, have I been around any elders recently? Or I didn't know exactly when I had gotten it. But then I soon found out that I got it from my work. But at first, I was just more nervous about the potential that I had spread it to someone else. And that would, to me, be really personally devastating.
Yeah. Did you feel like during the pandemic, were there ways you felt you needed to step in to be support for other people?
Definitely, I would say when I knew family members who were ill. So my stepdad did get it last year. I think maybe it was this year, but I think he got it last year. And so my mom was taking care of him, and so I was like thinking, what can I do to help them? Should I DoorDash them some food or something like that? And so there were times where I wanted to, I guess, help care for people, but I knew I couldn't go home and then risk getting it and then spreading it even more. And so it's just one of those, I guess, illnesses where you can't get too close. And so there's limited things that I felt like I could do. But I guess what I did on a personal level is just while I'm in Charlotte and even when I was home, making sure to wear masks in public so that I would dramatically reduce my potential of contracting it and then putting my family or friends at risk. Yeah.
Did any of your, here, I say here, at Duke or here in Huntersville, how did your relationships change here?
Yeah, so I guess I have group of some friends here in Charlotte, and so at first we were not, restaurants were closed, so you couldn't really go to a restaurant and have a meal with your friend. Even like going to a friend's houses up here was not something that I was really doing during that time either. I was living in an apartment alone. And so it was a time of a lot of solitude for me, even though I was in a relationship also during that time. But still, there's just like a feeling of aloneness that I think a lot of people felt, even if they were in the house with other people. But definitely being in an apartment alone, I felt a great sense of solitude, which at times, which actually most of the time was nice. But then there were times where I felt like, I would love to just be able to go to a bookstore or go sit down in a restaurant or live my normal life. And I missed going to class too during that time. So I had graduated and I was just like missing being in groups of people because I felt like I really wasn't getting that, except when I would go home to visit my family. That was the only time. And so I felt like I went from having a pretty social life to then having one that was more just about me or me being alone.
Did you feel like you had to choose between communities?
I don't know that I felt that way because in Charlotte I was alone a lot of the time, except with my fiance, and so then when I would purposely do things in Charlotte or live in a certain way because I wasn't going anywhere. And so I knew that the risk of me contracting COVID and then bringing it home was pretty low. And so I didn't feel like I had to choose. I just felt like the nature of the pandemic and with everything being closed, there weren't really opportunities for me to do anything anyways. And I don't know that I would have if I would have had the opportunity. So I wasn't going to large groups. And I don't know of many large gatherings also during that time. Yeah.
How about your relationship with technology? How was that affected by the pandemic? And how did your feelings change about any particular technology?
Yeah. It was, I think, nice in some ways, because it was a way to keep in contact with friends and also family members on social media to just see how they're feeling about the pandemic, if they're okay. So it was a good way, I think, for me and also just Indigenous people in general to stay connected, especially for those who were distancing themselves from their family members during that critical time. It was also a place of humor to make light of some of the tragedies that we were all experiencing. But unfortunately, it was also a place of misinformation that I saw a lot of happening in my community. So I saw a lot of anti-vaccine posts and believing that COVID was made up. And so there were several people who I know back home who were anti-vaccine or who believed COVID was fake. And then a few of them ended up dying of COVID. And so even that did not convince some of the people in my community that COVID was real or that the vaccine was, worth whatever risks that are associated with it. And so that was a big frustration for me with social media, was living, or even if I don't live there, I still feel like I live there. I feel like a citizen of home where I'm from. So it was frustrating for me to know that people know. I know that everyone back home knows someone who's died of COVID. Like it's almost impossible not to, because of the number of deaths that were happening. But then also for many of these people to believe that COVID was made up, or people were dying of something else, or so it's frustrating for me because I know they're seeing it with their own eyes. Unlike the massage lady who I was talking about here in Charlotte, who literally had not had the kind of experiences that I was having and the people in my community were having. So I could understand at least her ignorance or her lack of empathy. But for those folks living in Robeson County, I couldn't understand it, because we know multiple people who've died. And that was really hard for me to hear people or see people talking like that.
You talked about some of the things that were happening in the world. There was George Floyd's death. There was a lot of renewed attention to injustice and inequality,
right,
in that time period. Is that something that you connected with? Is that something you got involved with at all?
Certainly. That was also one of the worst parts of, I guess, 2020 in general, was what happened to George Floyd, seeing the video, seeing the initial, I felt like, union that people had around how unjust it was, what happened to him, and then soon after seeing people making up false narratives about how he died or justifications for his death. So that was a part that really truly sickened me. There were a lot of marches and protests during that period too. I participated in one, so that was probably the largest gathering that I attended during 2020. So I went to a Black Lives Matter march in Pembroke, North Carolina, which is in Robeson County, where I'm from. So the community there is about, or the demographics there are about 90% Native or so. So it's a very, very indigenous town in North Carolina. And I don't know how the march did not make national news, honestly. The counter-protesters threw bottles at us and had AR-15s, and they were like marching down the side of the street with the AR-15s, and there was only like 2 or 3 people who had those, so it wasn't a lot, but it was enough to be very frightening. They called us the N-word and called us N-word lovers, and they said they should have called the Klan on us. They yelled Trump 2020 over and over and over as we walked, because this was before the election. And they drove like motorcycles down the street and would rev the engines really loud on purpose so we couldn't hear what was going on during certain periods. So we would be like looking around to make sure nobody was shooting or attacking or anything. There was limited police presence, so it really could have gotten a lot worse than what it did. One man did try to assault one of us in the group of protesters, but I think he was arrested. Again, I don't know how it did not make national news, because I know like more than 90% of all the Black Lives Matter protests have been peaceful in general, and there was no kind of issues related to them. But that was one that was extremely traumatic. If I had to do it again, I don't know if I would go, just because I don't know, I feel like I almost developed a little PTSD from it, because I legitimately thought at one point we were going to get shot, and I knew there was nowhere I could go. There was nothing I could do because we were surrounded on both sides.
Were the people, the counter-protesters, were they locals as well?
Yes.
Did you know them? I don't mean were they personal friends, but I mean, are they folks that you would recognize at the store?
Yeah, I knew a few people. One I had worked with, one who was friends with some of my friends. Yeah, I knew at least 5 or 6 people in the crowd, if not more. I was trying not to make direct eye contact after some of the things they were saying.
And
But
I'm
yeah.
not suggesting you should have. I'm just
No, I
interested
know.
in-
I was just so, I was so frightened.
No,
I was just,
it
I would
sounds
look and
terrifying.
see a few people who I knew, and then I would be so in shock that they were there that.
Did you see anyone saying, "Hey, Joe, man, anyone trying to engage, or it just was not?
No, we were trying not to engage because we were so afraid. So we were just kind of doing the chants that we had talked about before. So no justice, no peace. We were saying that a lot, or things like that. And we had signs. So especially once we saw how many of them there were compared to us, I mean, we were outnumbered by more than double. So it was, nobody was saying anything to them that I saw. I mean, maybe others were, but we were too afraid because we knew they had weapons. Yeah. So I don't know how it did not make national news, but we all wore masks. But that was the only time I would say I was in like a large group for like that year. But it was outside.
And
But
did I understand correctly that many of the protesters were themselves Indigenous folk?
yeah, so the protesters who were with my group, you're saying, with the Black Lives Matter group, it was a mixture of Black and Indigenous folks. So it was started by, I think there's a Black student union at UNC Pembroke, which is the local college there, and they decided to have a march for Black Lives Matter. And I wasn't initially going to go, but the reason that I went is because there were a lot of townspeople that were announcing that they were going to go out and defend their town and do whatever. And so I wanted to walk in solidarity with the marchers to show them that not all people from the county believe that way. And so there were a lot of Lumbees also marching in the group as well.
Did that experience have an influence on future decisions to join any marches here? Or was that not applicable? Was it there?
I don't know if I would do one again, or if I would, it wouldn't be there maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Just because it was so terrifying. I mean, it was so terrifying. I remember I got back in my car and I just sobbed, and then I got home to my mama's house and I just cried, and then later I went to my dad's and I was just crying, and I'm not usually a person that cries. Especially not in front of my family or friends. If I cry, I usually cry alone. So I was extremely traumatized by what I had experienced, not only from the things they were saying and the ugliness of it, but from legitimately thinking that we were going to get attacked and knowing that I would have been pretty defenseless had something like that happened. Yeah.
How did your family and your community respond when you talked to them about what happened?
My family were kind of upset that I went because they knew it was going to be a dangerous situation because people had said they were going to go defend the town. It was just the nature of the comments on social media were that it was not going to be very peaceful. And so they were upset that I would put myself in a situation like that, but they understood why I made the decision that I made. And the community afterwards, there was a tremendous outcry of support for us and for the protesters, and a lot of dismay and disgust with what happened with the counter protesters that day. But then there are still obviously people who think that what they did was right as well. So, yeah.
It does sound terrifying.
Yeah, it was.
Before we started talking, we did the hand map exercise, and I wondered, you are under no obligation to share anything, but I wondered whether there were pieces of that you wanted to talk about or share.
Let's see. For, I guess, the parts that you talked about for transitions, I am transitioning currently. I guess we're still in the midst of the pandemic. It's not over, but I'm transitioning currently to being a mother. And so I'm pregnant right now. I'm about almost 28 weeks. I'll be 28 weeks tomorrow, due February or March or so. So I'm really excited about that. But the pandemic and just illnesses in general have become something that have become a bit of a terror for me. And so, like I said, I've been vaccinated, boosted. I got my flu shot this year just to make sure that, or hopefully I won't get the flu. And so the fear of contracting COVID or the flu or anything like that during this sensitive time is scarier to me than I think it would have been pre-pandemic, just because I've seen the nature of these illnesses and how they ravage the body. And how they're unpredictable in a lot of different ways. I mean, especially COVID. So I have a lot of fear around becoming a mother and exposing my child to illnesses, or that I don't think I would have ever thought about that before. Because my cousin has 2 kids, and in Indigenous communities, your first cousins function more like your sisters and your brothers. And so my cousin is more like my sister, and so her children call me aunt. And so, or ain't, we're country, so they call me Aunt Brittany. But when they were babies, I don't remember like feeling afraid of them getting sick or like kissing them and worrying, oh, they're going to get sick. And then my cousin, I know, is not like that in general either. But now in this new era, I'm kind of terrified. And it could be because I'm becoming a mother, which is different, I know, than an aunt, or an aunt. But that's one of my transitions for right now. So there's a lot of excitement tinged with fear for me.
Has that have the experiences that you had at the march, but similarly online, some of the antagonistic confrontations, or even you mentioned that when you went to college, encountering people whose ignorance or bigotry around Indigenous communities was something you had to deal with.
Right.
Has any of that affected your feelings around parenthood?
Definitely, for sure. So I have a lot of fears. So my child, my fiance is Black and I'm Native, and so our child will be both Black and Native. So I have a lot of fears around raising a biracial child in a time like this. I have a lot of fears around people's ignorance in general of not understanding mixed race children, and especially even in Indigenous communities, there's a lot of anti-Blackness, which is very obvious from the march. And so I have a lot of fears around that for my child, and that Native communities won't make space for his indigeneity. Even though, pre-colonization Indigenous people did not consider themselves in parts or fractions, or I'm half this and half that, or I'm, even when, with tribes, intermingling and people having relationships with different tribes. And even when colonization first started, there wasn't this kind of like fracturing of indigeneity. There's actually reports that, so certain tribes, in order to be a member of a tribe, you go by blood quantum, which says the percent of degree of Indian blood that you have. But there's statistics that show that tribes that have those will have less and less and less and less numbers each year, and will eventually, I don't know if be obsolete is the right word to say, but you don't want your numbers to go down every year for how many people that you have, especially for Indigenous people. And so counting yourself Indigenous only based on what part Indigenous you are is really harmful to Indigenous people, but I think something that a lot of Indigenous people do because of colonization. So I have a lot of fears around that. I could talk about my fears all day. I know probably a lot of new mothers have tons of fears, but I have some that are specifically related to indigeneity that I certainly worry about, again, but predominantly people not making space for my child, and then also raising a child who is Black in a world like this is also quite terrifying. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure.
When you imagine the future, and this goes a little bit to fears, but hopefully also to beyond just fears. Mm-hmm. When you imagine the future, how has your experiences of the pandemic, how has it affected what you imagine? Has it changed what you imagine work-wise? Has it changed what you understand about yourself? How does the future look different? I
think the pandemic caused a lot of reckoning for folks. if in some people it made them feel more grateful for what they have. In some people it made them kind of start questioning the way our society operates and wondering if there's a better way for us to live, in small ways and big ways. And in some people, I think it maybe triggered even more ignorance or harshness of thinking. But for me, I would say that it transformed my idea of work for certainly. So the idea of going into work every single day is no longer an appealing option for me. I would much rather have a blended schedule where I do have the opportunity to go in and get to know my coworkers and meet my students and teach in person, but also wanting the flexibility to work from home as well for safety, for saving the planet, so not driving so much. I mean, there's so many different benefits to working from home that I got to see firsthand from the pandemic. But then still, it also reinvigorated my own interest in having spaces or community spaces at work, or, having coworkers to go to lunch with is something that I really missed and really liked doing. And so I'm really interested in a hybrid model of work kind of going forward where I have the best of both worlds. And so I'm hopeful, and also I know that in my new role at Virginia Tech, I'll have the opportunity. In my role at Duke now, I also have the opportunity, so I work from home almost exclusively now, but in the beginning I was going into work, which is where I got COVID. I'm going to keep letting everybody know that. But
as a Chapel Hill graduate, I appreciate that.
Oh my gosh. I went to Chapel Hill too, but Duke is superior. I don't know. They probably have stronger germs at Chapel Hill. So I would probably got even sicker there. But anyways, yeah, so I mean, it totally changed my outlook on life. I think a lot of people, it changed their perceptions of work too, because now we're seeing a lot of help wanted signs at restaurants, for example. I used to work as a waitress. I made $2.17 an hour. You rely exclusively on the generosity of strangers, and hoping that they're going to tip you at the end of the day. But if they don't, then you're kind of out of luck. And so I think a lot of people began to realize, I don't have to do this kind of work anymore and live paycheck to paycheck. I can find another job where I work from home, where I make more money. And that's caused a lot of outrage, I think, in certain Americans who feel almost entitled to service for pennies on the dollar. And so I think a lot of people feel differently again about work and what they should be expected to do and how much they should be paid, and are really fighting more for a living wage, as opposed to before. Yeah.
I want to be respectful of your time.
Okay.
So I don't want to take up more of it than I told you I would.
Okay.
But I want to take a moment to ask, is there anything that you feel you haven't shared you want to be sure is a part of the record, or anything from your hand map or your larger experience that you think is really important for people to hear and understand?
I don't think so, but if you have other questions, that's fine.
Okay.
Just let me know.
Let me think if there's anything I want to be sure. Well, we didn't really talk about whether there was anything out of the pandemic that you see as a gift or a positive. I have 2 sisters, but I'm my mother's only child, and so I grew up, I'm not being alone or lonely, but I feel like only children know how to be by themselves, and so I've always been a person who kind of knows how to be by myself and play independently or figure out how to entertain myself. So I very rarely get bored. I never really experience boredom. And I don't know if a lot of only children feel that way, but I felt kind of almost prepared for the pandemic in certain ways because of that, because I can be in my apartment alone for days, or I could then, I don't have it anymore, I live with my fiance, but I could have stayed there for days reading books or watching shows and been perfectly entertained. But I guess it was the idea of being, I don't have a choice but to do that, is what made the pandemic feel so restrictive and unbearable sometimes. But I think for me, it reinvigorated my own personal characteristic of that being alone was okay. And I
I don't know if the right words to say is I admired that about myself. I don't know if that's bad to say, but I felt content most days being alone or kind of entertaining myself. And so I feel like it is a good thing in general to be okay with being by yourself, and the most intimate relationship you'll ever have is with yourself. And so I really feel like I kind of developed that even more during that time. And so for me, that would be a big gift of the pandemic, is kind of having an even greater purpose or greater responsibility to myself, and not just like always going to work or going here or being with this person or that person. It was like a time to kind of settle myself into myself more. Yeah.
Well, I'm curious, although you're welcome at any point to tell me things are none of my business, but
Yeah.
with that in mind, it sounds like over the course of the pandemic, your relationship with your now fiancé developed and changed into something closer, which is now a fiancé relationship. How did that work?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I would kind of go back and forth between it's from his house to my apartment before, and I would stay at his house a lot, and my apartment was almost getting no use before the pandemic.
So you were already dating?
We were already together. We were even engaged actually before the pandemic, and then his family moved into his house so that they wouldn't have to be alone in their cities, because his family's kind of spread out, and so then I went back to living at my apartment pretty much exclusively at that point. And I liked it so much. At first, I was so upset, and then I loved it. So, but our relationship, I think, transformed a lot. He also did a lot of personal growth and development during the pandemic that really kind of transformed our relationship into one that's really, really a lot stronger than it was before. And so for us and our relationship, it was a personal blessing in terms of our relationship, again, not for what the pandemic was to others, but
is that because your communication shifted from daily, I would say like mundane interaction to, I don't know, conscious, a more conscious interaction? You had to choose to interact?
Yeah, our relationship became a lot more conscious. And also, I think a lot of people just go through a period of personal growth during the pandemic, or like reflection. And so I think he was doing that a lot, especially going from living in his house alone or with just me to now his mom and sister were living there. And so I think being around a group of women was good for him, and like going back into kind of like living with family after not living with his family for so long was also really good for him in a lot of ways. And then also me being alone was good for me, because it helped me kind of reconnect to what I really like being alone. Like, it helped me kind of connect to that part of myself that I had not, that's hard to connect to when you're in a relationship. And so I think we both just started developing as individuals a lot more, and that made our relationship stronger.
Did it affect your relationship with his family?
No, I don't think so. I don't think it didn't hurt or anything at all.
Didn't hurt,
No.
didn't help,
Yeah. I think
change
it's
it.
pretty much stayed the same. Yeah. Yeah.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
Well, this has really been wonderful, and I am very grateful for the time that you've given us.
Yeah.